Following presentation is a 20-minute summary of the research conducted for my PhD in Information Design at the University of Pretoria. At the time of recording, the thesis has not been published, nor have I graduated. As such, this recording provides an overview of my thesis, but is not a formal publication. I would like to start by sharing some of the motivations for doing the research. I have worked for an online seminary called SATS for nearly 12 years, originally as their media manager. This has included video production, graphic design, advertising, running social media profiles, and generating course enrichment material. For the past 4 years, I have additionally served as the leader of the marketing team with commensurate responsibilities. Because we are fully online, the first time we meet our students is when they graduate. As of late 2019, our staff team has also been fully decentralized, working from their respective homes around the world. In our daily operations, we are constantly confronted with technological mediaries that are designed to facilitate and connect us. But they are also designed based on all sorts of assumptions about human nature, needs, and behaviors. For a decade already, I have felt an unease, a prick of conscience, when I encounter so-called best practices that conflict with my worldview and tools that dehumanize while claiming to be human-centered. This slowly developed into a sense that I must pursue formal, sustained research into human-centered design, the ontology of personhood, and to build a base from which my team at SATS can deploy operations and communications. I resisted for years, but eventually ran out of excuses. I felt a deep conviction that I needed to respond in obedience to a calling that I came to believe God laid on my life. This leads us to the research problem of the thesis. There is this decades-long pervasive movement of scholarship broadly called human-centered design, or HCDM. It was motivated and has been sustained by a well-intentioned, fundamentally good desire to improve disciplinary ethics in many fields and to generally serve humans better. But the reality is that the disciplinary ethics have not improved. My vocational training and industry practices are restricted to communication design, so that's where I focus my efforts. And within communication design, a strong case can be made that HCDM has resulted in worse ethics than before. How come the movement continues to achieve the opposite outcome it intends to, after decades of ongoing refinement? I noticed early on that no one has properly defined the primary subject of the movement, the human, that's supposed to be the hinge around which the entire enterprise pivots. Could that be why? I subjected this premonition to a stress test. Let's assume that one can develop ethics without considering the ontology of personhood and see where that leads. In fact, throughout the thesis, I engage and re-engage with this alternative approach in the various guises it has taken in the movement, including the 7 identified in the slide. It was premature to determine whether describing the primary subject would, in itself, fix the dilemma of ethics in the movement. In fact, that seems unlikely, but it became clear that this was at least one of the essential missing components, if not the complete solution. Since the goal was to do a better job of describing what human persons are ontologically, it became clear that the task at hand is hermeneutic in nature. The human person, as conceptually nebulous as it is, manifests in the following ways: the lived experiences and acts of the embodied human beings we encounter in the world around us, and in our own individual encounters with the world. The human then becomes a kind of text that we read and interpret to come to various conclusions, rightly or erroneously. And grappling with what humans are is not a new endeavor. It is something that has occupied great thinkers in many other fields for millennia. Rather than reinvent the wheel, I decided to design the study as a multidisciplinary investigation into the ontology of personhood, placing communication design theory in dialectic with more mature interlocutors, continental philosophy, Schillerian phenomenology, Ricoeurian hermeneutics, and Franklian Existenzanalyse. I explain how I arrived at this particular set of conversation partners in the thesis. Step was to review the literature. That is, to investigate the claims of HCDM. It doesn't have a robust ontology of personhood yet, but what elements does it have? What are its base assumptions about humans, and where do these come from? What are their implications? Even though I delimited my focus to communication design, what I encountered was a jumbled mess of discourses. And no one had developed a coherent taxonomy by which one could identify whether a given discourse is inside the movement, and to what extent, or outside of it. I improvised a taxonomy of my own, made up of various constituent and contributory discourses, and investigated their ontological and epistemological commitments. In the thesis, I dive into 9 constituent discourses and 4 external contributory fields. One examiner identified that my taxonomy is anemic in that it doesn't consider any internal contributory fields. In other words, expressions of HCDM in other design fields, such as interaction design and urban design. I wanted to acknowledge this criticism and will provide an explanation in a postscript to the thesis. One sees competing philosophical commitments in the movement. Some discourses adhere to social constructivism, some to utilitarianism, some to amalgams of disciplinary ethics, some to utopianism and atheism, and some to agnosticism and technocentrism. I concluded that the atheistic utopianist strands have, in the work of Richard Howells, the nearest thing to an investigation into the ontology of personhood. Also, empathic design comes closest to formulating a multidimensional vision of human persons, but even these fall far short of providing the necessary foundation for disciplinary ethics. This brings us to our first interlocutor, the hermeneutic phenomenology of Max Scheler. More than one examiner asked, why provide so much background and context in the thesis? Is this relevant to the study? In communication design scholarship, engagement with phenomenology is close to non-existent. Since this is a PhD in information design, I must assume my primary audience to be scholars in my field, and it seems they know nothing of the field of phenomenology. Those who do glance at phenomenology typically rely on secondary sources that have already dismissed it. There are claims that communication design is now post-phenomenological, even though it never had a phenomenological phase. This relates to another examiner's question: why Scheler? Why not Husserl and Heidegger? Well, those same secondary sources that disregard phenomenology tend to only consider Husserl and Heidegger's work. So my approach was to write a crash course in phenomenology to get the reader up to baseline, and then I built my argument on a phenomenologist who has not already been dismissed out of hand by scholars in the field, for whatever reasons. And to be fair, Scheler's approach has attributes that make it uniquely suited to my study, and simultaneously allow it to sidestep some of the criticisms leveled against Husserlian Heideggerian phenomenology, whether these criticisms are legitimate notwithstanding. Scheler aims to ignore metaphysical presuppositions and appraise phenomenological givens on their own terms. He's not primarily interested in what one can conclude ontologically from those givens. He wants to understand the mechanisms that allow those givens to emerge in the first place. He calls this approach, optimistically, presuppositionless knowledge, and his point of departure he terms the natural standpoint. Most of the thesis chapter engages with his monograph, The Formalism in Ethics. To help anchor his inquiry into ethical personalism in this work, he juxtaposes his polemic with Kantian formalism. Painstakingly builds a both-and ethical personalism, combining formal and non-formal components of human existence, the objective and subjective, the macrocosm and the microcosm, reason and affect. To grossly oversimplify his findings, he makes several important contributions to our understanding of personhood. First, values are not something we invent out of nothing. They are shaped by context and our individual lives, which indicates a subjective element, but at the same time, they are given in a priori hierarchies that predate culture and worldview. Similarly, our cognition carries objective and subjective components. There are complex, interwoven relationships between conation and purpose, perception and meaning, and the way values are given upon acts. But at the same time, our perception is shaped by our milieu. Ideology often determines how we interpret what we observe, but milieu often determines how we perceive, even before we have something to interpret. Second, there are Schiller's observations on personhood itself. Now, without getting into the minutiae of each, Schiller reflects on the person as he or she relates to 18 different aspects of lived experience. These are discussed one at a time in the thesis. Finally, because of the contributions made in empathic design discourse, I turn to Schiller's monograph on the nature of sympathy to develop an understanding of fellow feeling and its implications for our understanding of personhood. Schiller's contributions are significant, but not overtly ontological. At best, one can argue that his scholarship opens up into ontology, which is why it does not stand alone in the thesis. I supplement it with two further interlocutors. The first of these is Ricoeurian hermeneutics. Ricoeur is more than a conversation partner in this thesis. My methodology is modeled after his approach to multidisciplinary hermeneutic phenomenology. He makes different disciplinary discourses triangulate on subject matter using a three-pronged approach. First, he identifies the basic operational concepts within a body of theory, such as in Freudian psychologism. Second, he considers highly thematized but disharmonious concepts within that body of theory. Examples from HCDM are its approach to disciplinary ethics and what I termed philosophical philately. Third, he addresses unresolved problems within a discourse by placing it in dialectic with other discourses. For example, he places anti-phenomenological Freudianism in dialectic with Hegelian phenomenology. For this study, I place HCDM as it relates to communication design in conversation with the aforementioned interlocutory discourses. I mainly engage with three of Ricoeur's monographs to converge on my research topic. The first of these is his essay on Freud. It shows where some of the anti-phenomenological bent in HCDM comes from, why and where it is problematic, and it demonstrates Ricoeur's method, which I emulate. By the end of my engagement with this essay, I've laid out the nature of the hermeneutic problem and its implications when applied to human persons as the target text. The second work from Ricoeur is his monograph on the rule of metaphor. Again, it contributes to the study on more than one level. It helps dismantle the commonplace in communication design theory that design is visual rhetoric. In other words, it addresses a significant error in the communication design field's self-understanding. It also helps explain the lexical mechanics at work in formulating something like an ethical intent, human-centered design principles, and its constituent subject matter. It ameliorates not only design's efforts to understand human persons, but communication design's understanding of itself. The third Ricoeurian monograph is the well-known Oneself as Another, which contains, of the three, the most direct treatment of the ontology of personhood. This relies in part on developing a nuanced view of the relationship between selfhood and sameness, or, as he calls it, ipse identity and idem identity. He covers the subject matter in 5 waves. The first 4 waves, together, finally permit him to breach the topic of the ontology of personhood. At the same time, he injects personalism into the Aristotelian ethical intent and gives it lifeblood, showing that ethical praxis must be built on ethical personalism and guided by practical wisdom. Even though we've made so much progress already in the thesis, there are a few important loose ends that need tying up. Empathic design has a two-dimensional ontology of personhood, but it's clearly still deficient. So, what is it still missing? Schillerian phenomenology and Ricoeurian hermeneutics do a fine job of describing personhood, but is it possible to put their ideas to everyday use within a practical discipline, like communication design? And in my sphere of professional operations, my encounter with other human beings is almost always mediated by several layers of technology, as I mentioned at the outset. Is this a true analog of interpersonal face-to-face encounters? For these reasons and more, I finally turn to Franklian Existenzanalyse. Viktor Frankl relied heavily on Schillerian phenomenology to append Freudian and Adlerian psychotherapeutic models with his own, logotherapy. Logotherapy relies on a more personalist Weltanschauung, built on a multidimensional ontology of humans. Since I am no psychotherapy clinician, and the study is not related to medical ministry, I focus on Frankl's underlying existential principles, what he calls Existenzanalyse. As to the others, Frankl contributes on several levels. For one, he develops a polemic against reductionist psychologism, the same type that has so strongly influenced the development of HCDM. Second, he models an approach to refining his ideas that can be emulated in HCDM, an approach that does not always require outright retraction or recanting of bad ideas in the movement. Third, he helps me to ameliorate empathic design's model of personhood. He shows that what is missing in its dimensional ontology of humans is, ironically, the human dimension. Fourth, his criticisms of prioritizing technique over encounter in dealing with human persons are instructive and relevant to communication design. Treating humans as machines, what he calls homotechnician, is dehumanizing and leads to dreadful outcomes such as existential boredom, neurogenic neuroses, suicidality, and nihilism. This dovetails perfectly with Friedrich Georg Junger's reflections on the sociological aspects of technology and the deleterious consequences of combining it with a functionalist worldview. At the end of the chapter on Frankl, I briefly attempt to combine the main lines of his discourse that converge with Schiller and Ricoeur, but a lot more can be said on the subject. What does emerge is a remarkable congruency, despite these respective scholars' divergent approaches, interests, and aims. After all that, I concluded that HCDM must either revise its teleology or abandon the claim that it is human-centered, and I would strongly advise against the latter. This leads me finally to what was the most difficult part of the study, figuring out how to land the plane. What conclusions do I draw? After such a long and complex work, it would be easy to disguise my findings in highfalutin obfuscation, endless appeals to foggy nuances, and generally phrasing things in a way that leaves me with plausible deniability to fend off any future detractors. And here I must credit my supervisor for not letting me off easy. He insisted that I nail my colors to the mast and state my claims directly, unequivocally, and concretely. I followed the example set by Friedrich Nietzsche in Beyond Good and Evil, that is, to provide a set of axioms, each followed by a brief explanation. I received a request to develop a model summarizing the main findings of the thesis. Another person suggested that I have developed a model in my set of axioms. But one, after years of being confronted with the deep scars left in my field by reductionism, and two, Junger and Frankl's ominous warnings against prioritizing function and techniques over persons, that is not the note I wanted to end the study on. That is why I opted instead to invite all readers of the thesis to a personal encounter. My contact details will be shared in the closing paragraph of the final thesis, which will be available in the University of Pretoria's public online thesis repository after I graduate in May 2025.